All right, stop everybody. You gotta watch this video. This information could change your life. It's something the medical industry should be telling you and no one is. So we're gonna break down thyroid health and where we've come up to 2021 in this video. You gotta watch. So if you walk into a primary care office at any point, anywhere in the country at this time and say, I've got fatigue, and maybe you have brittle hair or nails or just, I don't know, skin's a little pale, apathetic, your doctor may run some tests on thyroid to check your thyroid. Now, the thing is, did you know that they're still using tests designed in 1920? Now, doesn't that seem a little strange to you? I think it's a little strange considering where thyroid research, thyroid testing has gone. That's why you have to be careful about who you trust your health to. So let me first, to help you understand where thyroid testing is at today and what you need to be aware of, and just health in general and for fatigue or anything you have going on, majority of practitioners, when they hear your symptoms, will always just look at thyroid, okay? That is a huge mistake. If I took a deck of cards and I said, pick any card out of this deck, and then I go, before you do that, we're only gonna give you 4 cards to pick from. And then I pick from those 4 cards. What I've done is, in my own way, impact what cards you get by reducing the deck. And so you kind of guide the conversation, or you kind of limit the chances or the statistical probability of them picking only a certain card by manipulating what you allowed them to pick from in the deck. That's what happens when practitioners only test for like 2 things in a wide world of reasons that could be the solution to your problem. And that's my issue. So to understand where thyroid testing has gone, we need to understand where it has been. And so let me give you the standard original thyroid model that kind of exists right now. So understanding this is a general schematic that is not in no way meant to be completely scientific, meaning that there's way more advanced layouts that you could look up. That's not the point. The point is to be very simplistic and minimalistic in order for you to understand something that's relatively complicated. Your hypothalamus and limbic center of the brain speak to your pituitary. It does that by releasing something called TRH. Okay? TRH is a message. A message is thrown at the pituitary receives it and then spits out something called TSH, thyroid stimulating hormone. It's meant to stimulate the thyroid. It's like, hey, buddy, pokes it and says, make thyroid hormone. So the thyroid then here, shown as a bow tie, because the thyroid is kind of a bow tie around your neck. You can kind of feel it if you look hard enough. And the thyroid then spits out 2 hormones, T4 and T3. Now, in the early days, they didn't know there was a difference between free and bound. Okay, so circulating hormone inside of your body, any hormone by the way, has a certain feature where some of it's being used, all right, and that's typically bound by something called albumin, which is a protein in the blood, which we'll get to. And then you have your free, and that's active hormone that can attach to a cell and then induce the cell to activate, right? And we'll talk about that in a second as well. I will say in this video, I'm going to get a little technical. Now, if you watch this video and say it was a little too much for me, don't you worry. I'm going to actually break down some of these videos into smaller videos and really kind of get more in depth on smaller, in-depth topics so you have a better understanding. So follow along because I want to think big picture about lab testing, which means I got to talk about everything in wide scope instead of zooming in. So T3 and T4 now are 2 hormones circulating around. Some's bound, some's free to be used. Free is what you feel. Up until right around 1970, we didn't know that there was a distinction. And so that's a big, big turn in thyroid testing. And then those messages go to the cell and they make the cell essentially jostle. There's 3 things that thyroid's really, really good for. Those things include increase in metabolism. So what does that mean? Metabolism essentially means the body taking something, processing it, and turning it into something else or eliminating it. Metabolism kind of reflects the amount that your cell is busy materializing things from something into something else. Okay, metabolism happens to almost, everything in your body, and the rate at which it metabolizes has a lot to do with your metabolism. So as your body makes more thyroid hormone, your metabolic rate or your metabolism of things should go up. It's a very simplistic version of it. The other thing that it does, increase energy production. Okay, so the body has this very interesting thing that it does. It will, so in the cell, your body makes something called ATP, which is energy. It will ramp up its energy production, so the mitochondria get busier in exposure to thyroid hormone. And then last has to do with tissue control. Now, what does that mean, tissue control? So the body, using thyroid hormone, can control the rates of growth of certain tissues inside the body. And so it's one of the features that the thyroid that we don't talk a lot about, but it can control that through thyroid levels, okay? So we understand this is like a very raw model of how thyroid works. Okay, great. Now let me give you a little bit of thyroid history. This is important. I'll explain why. In 1880, they found the first thyroid disease. They didn't know what they were looking at, and they kind of figured out, okay, this is related to the thyroid. They still didn't understand much, but they saw the first disease in 1880. It wasn't all the way till about 1900 that researchers actually found iodine-rich thyroid tissue, which they called thyroiodine. And they found that inside of the tissue, and then they go, okay, iodine, thyroid function, there's something here. And that was immediately followed by the deficiency of 1920. So none of us were around in 1920. If you are, you're an animal. But if you were, you would remember that there was an extreme deficiency that happened in the population. Whether you know it or not, in 1900s, early 1900s, is when processed food really, in the Industrial Revolution, things were taking hold over time. And believe it or not, the diet started to change a lot. And because of that, one of the issues, especially in processed food, people eating different, behavior starting to change, iodine levels in humans became low, and in children it was the worst. And in fact, certain pockets in America, 70% of kids had iodine deficiency and started getting goiters, little growths on the thyroid. So the government was like, oh man, we have a public health issue. What are we gonna do? Let's add iodine to salt, which is what most table salt has now, has iodine attached to the sodium. And that's one of the ways that we try to raise iodine levels in the population. However, I'll tell you that fails to do everything, especially based on certain lifestyles. And we're gonna break down why that's important. So then in 1920, essentially, when this started all happening is when they first formed the first blood test related to thyroid. The first test that was made and then was significantly studied was based on some very rudimentary things. They did not know about free and bound thyroid hormone yet. And so if you had gotten a test in 1940, 1950, and especially if you were showing signs of deficiency, they would have tested TSH, T4 total, and iodine. Now, what I'm going to tell you is that the primary amount of research that is done today is done on TSH, T4, and some is on iodine, but primarily TSH and T4. Now, there are some new ones that come out about 10 years later on something called T3 uptake, and then there's free T4. But by and large, most of the data that your doctor goes off of, it was from 1920 when they're learning in school. The endocrinologists learning this. This is what they learn. That's it. Okay. Now that at the time was adequate. Today, this is not adequate and not okay. Let me show you the new model that's about the evolved thyroid model that evolved probably right around 1990s or so. We understand now that the hypothalamus stimulates the pituitary, okay, communicates that. Communication's important and can be thrown off by stress and other conditions, neurological conditions as well. The pituitary, now this is where a lot of problems can happen, particularly with birth control, by the way, sex hormone binding globulin, prolactin levels, particularly with high estrogen-based birth controls. That's something they don't tell you either. So that pituitary still communicates with the thyroid, but here's what we know now. There's this ever-evolving process of how much thyroid hormone gets bound, how much of it gets kicked out of the system, and how much of it gets converted. So we begin to understand that, oh, what we really need to be focusing on is free thyroid hormone, because that's what you feel. You don't feel bound thyroid hormone. And the hormone that you feel most is not TSH. You don't feel TSH. It's not T4. You barely feel T4. What you do feel is T3, particularly free T3. So we know that today. We also know that the thyroid is not the only place for conversion. No, not at all. In fact, the tissues that require the most metabolic rate are the highest converters of T4 into T3, which is the conversion that has to happen in order for you to feel thyroid hormone. If you've got a bunch of T4 and you've got TSH but no T3, you're still going to be tired, right? We didn't know this for a very long time. So we know things like the liver, the heart, the kidneys will conjugate or convert T4 into T3. We didn't understand that before. So now we begin to realize that other organs are playing a part into how our thyroid functions, which becomes more important as we continue. So you've got this peripheral conversion of T4, okay, into T3. This is important. So now we understand that not only is there a production thing we need to look at, there's a conversion, not from just TSH to T4. Everything really hinges also on total production and conversion, which the old test doesn't show. And then also how much reverse T3 we're making, meaning how much of does our body just kick out? Because of stress, it says, let's immobilize T3. T3 is very active, right? It's a stressor on the body to a certain degree. So the body will choose to get rid of it in a number called reverse T3. And you'd want to know how much your body's making of that too to understand how stressed your thyroid is. And then we understand now that T4, T3 don't all go to every cell in the body. They do, but in different amounts in different areas. More T3 tends to be in more metabolically active areas. So the body will kind of choose or targeted tissues where T3 and T4 go. We didn't know that either. So a lot has changed in a very short period of time. The evolution is something you need to understand because the science is evolving, the medicine isn't. It was right around 1950 to 1970 that they started looking at replacement, thyroid hormone replacement. And it worked so well in the short term that a lot of practitioners have stayed right there. They haven't learned any more about thyroid because they're like, hey, why not just give you replacement? But that's not acceptable. I will do a whole video on why thyroid hormone is a mistake long term, and I think you'll agree. So in the 1980s, you would have seen TSH, T4 total, that's not bound and free, T3 uptake. T3 uptake has everything to do with how much TBG is in the system, thyroid binding globulin. Now, that was a test that was done then because they still didn't have a test for free T3. They figured out how much T3 you had by figuring out how much total T4 you had, minusing or calculating from T3 uptake. All that means is how much binding globulin is taking T3 out of the system. So you don't want to be too high or too low. You'll be over anxious or fatigued. So that's how they looked at it. Now, when I see majority of my clients that come in, this is what they're getting. This is 1980s. I get some that's just looking at this. Why? So here's what's happened. Now as we go, we learn. In the 2000s, if you go to an endocrinologist that is a functional practitioner, this is why it's important that when you look for coaches or you look for doctors, you don't just walk down to the next door primary care practitioner, because majority of them are cozy in their career. They're not learning new stuff. Whatever they learned in 1980 whatever or 1960 whatever is the same thing they're doing now. They got their shtick and they're not changing it. But if you go to someone who's forward thinking, they're going to look at all the aspects of thyroid. So we want to look at free T3, meaning how much isn't bound. We want to look at free T3, meaning how much isn't bound. Some may even want to look at total T3 and T4 to get an idea of how much is bound, because you can separate that number by subtracting those. It's another way to do it. Or you can take out T3, T4 and put in a T3 uptake if you want. Reverse T3, how stressed is my thyroid and it's taking T3 my body could be using and metabolizing it, basically reversing the molecule so it can't be used. Iodine, how low is my iodine? Selenium and zinc. Iodine, selenium, and zinc have everything to do with the health of your thyroid. Those are very low in the standard American diet. So most people, when they get deficient in that, your thyroid is going to run a little bit slower. So why not look for it? Now, the thing you should know about iodine, zinc, and selenium is they're being tested through blood work. And there are better methods of testing mineral sufficiency in human beings today. So the last two, the most underdiagnosed disease in the country if you have low thyroid is actually Hashimoto's. But still only 15% of doctors run TPO and TGA antibody tests to look for Graves and Hashimoto's in their blood work. And so everybody goes along in life not knowing that they're suffering from a disease because they just won't run another $2 test inside their blood panel. Irresponsible. So after, into the 2020s, thyroid information takes off, okay? We start realizing that the thyroid is not alone. It doesn't sit on an island by itself. No. It's the backup, like the pituitary, to everything. So it's not the primary to anything. This is the problem. Because if it's not the primary, then why is it the first thing that your doctor's looking at when you say you have fatigue? Your body is this intercommunication highway, and everything's communicating and everything's impacting everything else. So what we've come to understand in hundreds of research articles and double-blind placebo-controlled tests have shown all the different impacts in these areas. The evidence is there and no one's using it. First, hypothalamus and pituitary still have an effect on thyroid. That's true, right? And then the thyroid speaks to every cell in your body. That's true, targeted different cells. But what we learn today now, the liver. If the liver's underfunctioning, you will slow down thyroid conversion. And you may even production sometimes and reverse feedback, okay? This is getting into, then we look at sex hormones. Sex hormones, okay? Did you know, like, birth control affects thyroid? If your hormones get way out of whack, it's gonna slow your thyroid down. If androgens get too high, it can have a negative impact on your thyroid. All of these directly impact them, and we don't look at sex hormones when we talk about thyroid. We've got lifestyle. So this is lifestyle. So what does that mean? Lifestyle means how much you're stressing, how you're living, right? Your day-to-day. All of that makes an impact, on your thyroid. Next, gut. The microbiome has been shown that certain microbiomes, certain strains of bacteria negatively impact thyroid health. So no one's even looking or talking about gut, right? Training. Did you know that the more that you train, the more aggressive that you train, and if you're in the middle of a really aggressive weight loss process and training's high, your thyroid will look lower. It's supposed to. It's turning itself down. It's supposed to do that. It's just like how your body uses insulin to make or to convert food or to get glucose absorbed, essentially, right? So if you're not eating much food, insulin's down. If you're eating a lot of food, insulin goes up. Now, it's usually within a short time frame, very similar to thyroid. So if you get your thyroid test and they don't ask you about your activity level, what are we doing? Next, cortisol. Stress hormone directly slows thyroid over time. Acute short-term stress raises thyroid function. Long-term stress lowers thyroid function. That should absolutely be looked at in every test. So this is nutrient sufficiency. So nutrients, lots of them like zinc, selenium, and many more, directly impact thyroid function. So even if you've done a lot of other things to help your body and you're still nutrient deficient, your thyroid's still gonna run slow. Calories, I cannot stress this enough. There's enough data on long-term caloric restriction, lowering thyroid levels, and then not coming back, at least 10% of it, when you go back up in calories. Meaning every time you diet hard, you're hurting your thyroid, unless you do it the right way. Right? And so all of these impact this in a very special way. This one here is kidneys, okay? So kidneys. So kidney function directly impacts how your body metabolizes some of your thyroid hormones, right? And then not only that, I mean, there are other things that metabolize. So for example, your albumin levels. So if your albumin levels, if you've been dieting really hard, are super, super low, that can impact thyroid metabolism as well. And so they both have this interrelationship to thyroid function that you may not have thought about. So all of these really impact the thyroid in multiple different ways. And what it leads to, right, here, at the cell, the last thing that I want to point out is that if you're taking thyroid medicine or you've been stressing out too much, if too many of these get off, your thyroid will get insensitive at the cellular level. You have receptor sites on your cell. And if too many of these get off, you won't be as sensitive. Every cell will stop listening to it. So there's even cell insensitivity. So there's all this going on, and I don't want to overwhelm you. I'm going to make it simpler. But if we know now that all of these impact, why would we just slap a thyroid medicine right on top of it without trying or even looking at some of these other factors? Because what I'm sharing with you is if you have a thyroid issue and you don't look further, you're probably missing the root cause. Well, so then something else is going to pop up after that. So what good is it to stomp out and feel good for a little bit, putting thyroid medicine in, to miss whatever the reason is, and then that cause another problem later that you got to keep plugging holes? So here's where we're at, gang. We've gone from this to this. These are all the tests that are now available that are really good to be checked on. Evaluate your training, evaluate your diet, evaluate stress. Look at a standard thyroid program or blood sample. The blood test is offered on nutritiondynamic.com. Many doctors will offer this. 4-point cortisol, though, is done through spit test, or you can just do a cortisol blood test, but cortisol blood test is not as good. You got Dutch test to look at hormones. I love that. Intracellular nutrient testing. So looking at blood work isn't always the best idea and the most accurate to find out how sufficient your mineral levels are. You can do an intracellular nutrient test offered by SpectraCell, or you can get it through Avexia if the dietitian or if you have a functional nutritionist can get that. That test's amazing. And then a stool test to look at what bacteria is in your gut. Now, I'm not saying you have to do all this. Okay? I'm not going there at all. Don't stress yourself out with that. What I'm saying to you is why, when you walk into an office, this is still what you're getting. You couldn't add a couple things? Is the country not worth more? Is your health not worth more? Are we going to continue to tolerate this kind of work with practitioners that are practicing medicine today that you depend on for your health? Here's my recommendation. If you're someone who's struggling with fatigue, other thyroid symptoms, brittle nails, hair, memory issues, brain fog, okay, there is a simpler solution without jumping right into thyroid medicine. And I'm not saying you can't take it temporarily, but the truth is you need to figure out what the root cause is. That's what I'm telling you. If there's smoke, there's fire. So don't just waft away the smoke and leave what could be the fire that comes back later. Learn more about what's going on with your body. And if you could naturally get your body back running again, that is always the first way to go. It doesn't mean the medicine isn't there, but the fact that we just jumped right to thyroid medicine for everybody is a mistake, because now your body's going to depend on that medicine. And now you're dependent on one more medicine, which is what the medical system really wants, whether they tell you that or not. If you really want to know and you want to get in depth, my company or anybody, the recommendation is a Dutch test to look at like cortisol hormones, dopamine function, which is what that other D was, by the way, in effect. It looks at sex hormones. It looks at B vitamins, because your nutrient deficiency B vitamins really helps adrenals and helps the whole system. And then a standard thyroid panel. So if you run these two things, you're going to learn so much about your body, and you're going to help yourself figure out how to balance this, not this. I hope this helps.